Thank you, Ajay and Vikram, for inviting me to speak with you all on Manthan. It's quite a privilege to speak on this platform that one has been seeing right from the first meeting that Manthan organized many years back, and to be speaking to an audience which a lot of who would belong to my home city, and that is an opportunity I've rarely ever got. So thank you both once more. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I'll try and kind of lay out the situation of hunger and malnutrition in India, um, not only during the context of this national lockdown post the pandemic, but in fact, what was the situation earlier, and what has been the government response and what are the gaps and so on. Um, and of course, I would be happy to have a discussion at the end. I know that Manthan audience is known to pose some very tough questions, so I look forward to that too. So, but before going into pre-lockdown, just starting with the current context, and I think in a way it's also good that I'm following Barkha Dutt, who spoke on this platform 2 weeks back, where she laid out so clearly and you know, the description of the heartrending stories of people who were going to all kinds of lengths to just go back to their villages, to go back to their hometowns, because of the kind of situation they had been put in the places that they were in when the national lockdown was announced suddenly. And I would go so far as to say it was an ill-planned lockdown, although some measures were required to contain the viral. So in this kind of a crisis, what we are seeing is that the food crisis in the country has been amplified, and hunger is an issue which is now recognized by many. We've been repeatedly seeing images in the media, through newspapers, through videos and so on, of people hungry, people desperate to get the next meal, young children not having eaten for many days, and so on. And post the lockdown, there are now some various studies. For example, the Azim Premji University has done a study where on the phone they did a survey of over 5,000 people across the country. It's not representative of all classes, but largely the working class of the country. And they found that 77% of the households said that they're consuming less food than before. 66% of the households said that they lost employment, and almost half the households that they spoke to said that they do not have money to even buy 1 week's essentials. So that is the scale of the problem post the lockdown. And this we are seeing not just in terms of these kind of data, but if you look at particularly in the months of March, April, early May, when the national lockdown was stringently on, in Delhi, for instance, if you went out to these feeding centers and the homeless shelters where the state was distributing food, the queues were so long and sometimes running up to 2 kilometers or more. And there were so many people in these queues who would usually not go to these kind of feeding programs or would be comfortable receiving free food, but it was sheer desperation that made them do that. But when we look at all these lockdown figures, we must also remember that this is not something that is temporary, and this is something that has become much more visible post the lockdown. But hunger has always been a problem in our country, and not to say that there's no improvement and that people have always been very hungry and malnutrition has not changed in the last 50 years. There have been improvements, I'll talk about that too. But overall, that the problem of hunger is something that our country continues to face despite having economic growth post the 90s, which has been quite uh, significant. So I just want to share one figure which people would be familiar with because it keeps coming in the newspaper each year, that there's something called the Global Hunger Index, which is brought out, which ranks country according to the level of hunger that they have. And they do not rank. So if you can see the map that I'm sharing, the countries which are in gray are countries which are not included in these index. So it's mainly the developing countries which are included, and India comes in a category which they call as serious. That is, there are serious levels of hunger. And like we can see in the map, the category that we are in is the category in which many of the sub-Saharan African countries which we normally like to look down upon and think that we are much more advanced than. In terms of hunger and malnutrition, we are as bad as these countries, and that is a bit of a shame and also a matter of concern, because these other countries, in terms of their per capita incomes, are much, much poorer than India is. They're also countries which are food insecure, in the sense that they do not produce as much food as they require. And like we see as I go ahead, both these things are different in India, in the sense that we have enough food grain and we have income definitely higher than these countries. If you can just look at the left, these ranks, I just put together the ranks of countries, our neighbors in South Asia. Once again, where we like to believe that in South Asia, India is like the powerhouse and much better. But on this matter of global hunger, or of the Global Hunger Index, while the rank of India is 102 amongst the countries that were ranked, the rank of Sri Lanka is 66. Nepal, which has a per capita income which is about half of India, is 73. Bangladesh, again, much poorer than India, the rank is 88. Even Pakistan ranks about 8 ranks higher than India in this Global Hunger Index. So this was something I wanted to just share to show that the issue of hunger in India and the issue of hunger relative to the world is something that is of a serious concern. And this is something that was there before the COVID pandemic or the lockdown. If we look at child malnutrition figures, which is also part of this index, but which is what people use, then you see that according to the National Family Health Survey, which is the data, nationally representative data that we have, about 38% of the children are stunted. And this means it is an indicator of chronic malnutrition. That is 38%, 4 out of 10 children under the age of 5 have a height less than what they are expected to have for their age. There is an improvement in this, as I said. Like you can see, in 2006, almost 50% of the children were stunted. That's the blue bar. And by 2015, that came down to 38%. So we had a 10 percentage point improvement in stunting. But considering the scale of the problem, that is still very, very slow. If this is the rate at which we go, then it will be a very long time till we can address it. And even if we look at the other indicator, which is wasting, which is an indicator of acute malnutrition, whether the child had an infection recently, has the child been getting food in the recent past, and so on, even that is high, almost 20%, which the WHO calls an emergency situation if you have wasting over 20%. So this is the context in which we have been seeing the COVID lockdown happen. And it's not just the context of hunger. Just a few more figures I want to give you just to lay out the context of when the lockdown happened. So if you look at unemployment, for instance, it became big news last year. The unemployment rates in India are now highest in the last 40 years. And this again is not a new problem. Post the 90s itself, we have been seeing that the employment generating capacity of growth is something that has been coming down. So for each percentage of growth in the GDP, the number of jobs that are getting created has been consistently coming down in the country. As a result, what we see that in a country where there's so much poverty, people cannot really remain unemployed. They do something or the other. And therefore, what we see is that more than 90% of our population works in what is known as the informal sector, without regular contracts, no minimum wages, and so on, which is why we saw the kind of migrant crisis that we see happening post the lockdown, because they are in the informal sector, that as soon as the lockdown happened and economic activity stopped, a large proportion of these people lost their jobs, did not have any savings. For example, the NSS data from last year shows that more than 80% of people living in India, the workforce, earns less than 18,000 rupees a month. So if that is the level of incomes of most people in this country, we can imagine that if they do not get income, if they do not get their wages for a few weeks, they quickly run out of whatever savings that they have. And that is the kind of crisis that we saw happening. The growth that we have had has also been one which has been hugely inequality generating. There is a lot of data. Obviously, if we have been having growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, employment is not being generated, that obviously means that the growth is benefiting some more than the others. This is not to say that absolute poverty has been increasing. Across the board, people's living standards more or less have increased in the last 20 years, but it has improved much better for the top, say 1 to 10%, than for the bottom 80% of the population, who are the ones I'm mostly concerned with in today's talk. So for example, 73% of the wealth that was generated in 2018 went to only the top 1% richest, whereas the poorest half saw only 1% increase in their wealth. And all of this reflects, when this kind of a crisis comes, that it becomes immediately a crisis of hunger and starvation for the poor, where, for example, another data that of the income that the working poor have in this country, actually this is the average for the entire country, 52% of consumption expenditure is on food. So if most of the income, most of what you're earning is being spent on food, and of the remaining also a huge percent is on essentials like transport, education, health, and so on, as soon as that income stops, then we see that there is a crisis of food that emerges. And with this kind of growth pattern that we've had, and the last 2-3 years, particularly post demonetization, the kind of slowdown we have been seeing, we were already seeing the beginnings of the food crisis in some pockets of India. So for example, as the Right to Food campaigns after from 2016, and this is something we've not been able to keep pace post the lockdown, we were just recording reported starvation deaths in newspapers. And we had about 80 deaths that we had recorded, and we tried to go back and see what was going on in most cases, and did see that it was a combination of livelihood crisis along with there being no state response, which resulted in people being so hungry that ultimately some of them also died. Of course, this is hugely controversial because it's a political issue, and so people would never accept that a starvation death is a starvation death. People are hungry, then they contract some kind of a disease, they might get malaria, TB, whatever, and die of that infection. But we must also remember that many of us who are part of this talk, if we get a malaria or a TB, we would not die so easily, and it is the underlying malnutrition which results in the death. So basically the point that I'm trying to make is that while there is the whole crisis that the lockdown has thrown upon us, the crisis that the COVID pandemic has brought upon us, it is not something that has just happened out of nowhere, but it is actually a reflection of the kind of uneven growth and the situation of hunger and malnutrition that we already had before this happened. And then when this the lockdown came, that obviously was amplified much more, and it affected the poor and the marginalized much more than people who have some kind of a support. So having said what the overall situation was, I do want to start a little bit with the strengths that our economy had to deal with this kind of a crisis, because I think that is also important. Before I go into talking about how this whole hunger is a homegrown crisis, I want to lay out a little bit about the kind of social services, social welfare infrastructure that India has. And that is something that we have been able to use along with its gaps. But if we did not have that social welfare infrastructure, we can only imagine how much worse the situation would have been. What do I mean by this? Again, to give just a few numbers and examples. For example, we have something called the public distribution system, the PDS, which many people, say my age and older, would be more familiar with, because in our childhood, everybody used to have a ration card and people would have access to ration. Some people would take it, some did not. For example, I remember in my house, sometimes sugar would come from the ration card, or the people working at home would be given a ration card to go and take the grains from there. So the ration card works through a network of fair price shops, what is known as ration shops across the country. And there are more than 5 lakh ration shops across the country which are functioning and continue to distribute grain, sugar, kerosene, various items every month. Even before the lockdown happened, over 23 crore households in this country had ration cards, which is about 60% of the population. That included about 80 crore beneficiaries. We have a school midday meal program which provides cooked food in government schools across the country. And on any given day, over 11 crore, again, this is pre-lockdown, over 11 crore children are given a hot cooked meal across the country. Of course, the quality varies from state to state, district to district, but there is a meal that is provided to over 11 crore children across the country, which involves the employment of over 25 lakh cooks and helpers. We have something called the ICDS program, which is the Early Child Care Program, which distributes food to young children, pregnant and lactating women. We have over 14 lakh Anganwadi centers, which feed this food to 8 crore children and about 2 crore pregnant and lactating women. So I can go on just to say that there is this massive scale of programs that happen in this country every day, day in and day out, through which, and I'm only talking about the food distribution programs, through which food is distributed to the people. And often through the field studies that we do, and when we meet people and talk to them, we find that each of these food programs, although they're really tiny, when you look at the individual entitlements, 5 kgs per head per month, 100 grams of rice in the midday meal with some dal, and maybe if they're lucky to be in a state, maybe an egg. But even this little thing makes a huge difference to people who are living on the margins of hunger, who are living with very uncertain incomes. This provides the basic kind of minimum food to ensure that they do not fall into starvation. And then it allows them to work, and their wages then contribute to the other needs, better quality foods, vegetables, fruits, buying other consumption goods, and so on. And obviously running all these programs is a massive exercise. The other point I want to make is that these programs are not something that came out only of the largest of the state, but in fact, each of these has been a result of struggle, a struggle of people involving civil society movements, involving NGOs, involving political parties, a lot of grassroots mobilization, including using Supreme Court public interest litigations. A lot of work has gone into putting pressure on governments, just whatever government it has been, to make them ensure that these programs are running, that they are constantly improving, and that they reach people. A number of these are now legal entitlements. For example, the National Food Security Act that was passed in 2013 unanimously by all parties includes a lot of these as legal entitlements. And all of this came as a struggle of people where they use their constitutional rights to say that these are rights that we have and that we are contributing members of this economy, and we have to be provided this basic social security. Now, given that we had this kind of an infrastructure of a social security programs, in the time of the crisis, some of these things could be immediately used to address the kind of hunger, the migrant crisis. And of course, the migrant crisis was most visible, but the livelihood crisis was much more widespread across the country. This is something that could be used immediately to reach out to people. So what we saw happening, for example, was just a week, less than a week after the lockdown, the first announcement that the government made included something called the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, in which they announced that everybody who has a ration card will be given 5 kgs of food grains for free, 1 kilo of dal per household for free. Now, this is something that was possible because we had a PDS system, because we had ration shops in every village, something that should have been thought of even before the lockdown was announced. But even after a delay, at least that is something that within a week the government was able to announce, because we have a system. We have a system of procuring grain, we have a system of transporting grain, and we have a system of distributing it to people, and people are familiar with this system. Similarly, once the lockdown kind of lifted, we have been able to announce that NREGA, under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, work will be provided in rural areas to whoever demands for work. And if we look at the data for the last 2 months, we see that about 40% more work days have been created this year compared to last year, which again shows the demand that there is for work, and also that this has been possible because we had a legal entitlement for work on demand in rural areas. We must remember why I'm making this point also is that because often in the pink press, as well as by the government themselves, both by the UPA 2 as well as the current NDA government, repeatedly you hear arguments that these programs are a waste of resources, that they're increasing the fiscal deficit, that they're increasing subsidy bill, that they're full of leakages, and that they're completely useless, and that they should be done away with. For example, the Prime Minister himself a few years back in Parliament made the statement that NREGA was a monument to the failure of the previous government. But now we are saying it is this NREGA, precisely this NREGA program, which which the government is able to use to help people in this time of crisis. And like I said, it is not charity. It is really something that people have fought for and won in a hard-won struggle to get these entitlements. And we must remember also that in our country, 3/4 of the taxes are indirect taxes. So every poor person, anybody who even buys a bar of soap, is contributing to the revenue that our country is generating. Also, what we see, going back to the Azim Premji University study that I mentioned, these older programs for which there is an infrastructure have relatively done a better job in reaching people than the newer programs like the direct benefit transfer. So we often hear that instead of all these big monumental failures, the best thing would be for the government to just transfer cash into people's accounts so that they can buy what they want to, and that will take care of no middlemen and no inefficiencies and no corruption. But this study, for example, and this is something that many studies are showing, shows that of the 5,000 odd people they spoke to, 77% of the vulnerable households said that they received the free ration support during the lockdown, whereas a little less than half the vulnerable households said that they received the cash transfers. So something that for the urban middle class seems like a very easy thing, that the money is put into your account and you can take it. Actually, that is more difficult than going to a ration shop and taking your ration. Why is that? I mean, simply if you just look at numbers, 5.4 lakh ration shops in the country, 1.2 lakh bank branches, of which only about 25 to 30% are in rural areas. There is a lockdown, there is a problem with transport. What is it that people can access? They can access their ration shop, which is in walking distance, rather than trying to find transport to go to a bank account to collect the measly 500 rupees that they are being given, and then to go to some other market to buy the grains. So we have to understand that given the situation the country is in, not just in the lockdown, but the level of development that we have and the level of development of markets, the PDS plays a huge role in allowing people to access at least their basic food requirements. And in most cases, this is only grains. It's only rice and wheat that is given. In a lot of the southern states, dal and tea and certain other items are also given through the PDS. So this, I would say, is kind of the positive part of the story, and it is something that is important that we keep in mind, that when we keep, and especially people like me who are part of these movements, we do keep highlighting often the gaps in the system and what more needs to be done to reach people. At the same time, we also need to remember that the impact of these public programs cannot be underestimated. And India has had a history of strong social policy, which has been guided by pressure from the people, and much more needs to be done. So I will now come into the much more needs to be done part, because obviously if we have all of this, at the same time, like I said in the beginning, we also have the situation where we have the highest rates of malnutrition, we have the highest levels of hunger compared to many other countries across the world. So obviously something has been going very wrong as well. And what is it that has been going very wrong? So one can talk about each of these programs separately, and all of them have their problems. I want to focus on the public distribution system because, like I said, one, it is a huge program. It has a very big outreach, over 80 crore people right now. It addresses the entire household, therefore it deals with the first step of basic food security. And also at one level, it is kind of, whenever there is a problem, when you talk about what represents corruption in this country, the PDS keeps coming up. Therefore, I want to talk about the gaps in the PDS, as well as, like I said earlier, it is not all about gaps. It's in fact quite a huge, massive exercise which reaches a lot of people. But at the same time, we have this huge contradiction. And what is that contradiction? Other than, of course, the contradiction that we have these programs and people are hungry. we also have this contradiction that many of you must have seen. It has been reported in the newspapers quite a bit the last couple of months, of mounting food grains in the Food Corporation of India go downs. When I checked a few days back, it was almost 100 million tons of rice, wheat, and paddy that are in the stocks of the FCI. And obviously, this 100 million tons did not get hoarded in these 2 months post the lockdown. This is something that has been going on for some time now, where we are procuring grain, but we are not distributing it. So what does it show? One of the things it does show is that as far as the farmers in our country are concerned, they have been doing their job pretty well. They have been producing as much food grains as we require. And although there can be more productivity improvements, which depends on rural infrastructure, but as far as the production of basic cereals goes, there is food sufficiency in India. But gone are the days of the 1960s when we had to depend on imports for food sufficiency. So on the one side, we have food sufficiency in terms of production. On the other side, and it's a good thing, I think, but because of the pressure from the farmers groups, the government also procures these grains at minimum support prices. This is one of the main demands of the farmers movements that we keep seeing once in a few years. And particularly in and around election years, you see that the procurement kind of goes up. So the government does a good job of procuring the grains. There are issues there as well. I won't get into that. But once the grain is procured, there is obviously an issue in distributing the grain. So which results in the situation that we are in today, where we have 100 million tons of food grain on the one side, and on the other side, people hungry, people not having enough food, people walking thousands of kilometers because they do not have enough food, and we don't seem to find a way to match these two together. Why is it that that is happening? And this is where I want to argue that this is at the heart of it is two things. One, and this the primary thing, which I think even Barkadat kind of spoke about when she was talking 2 weeks back, is the complete apathy that governments across the board have for the poor in our country. Although they are voted in by the poor, they vote much more than the rich do. When it comes to public policy, it is really always doing the very minimal required. And therefore, you are happy and you think you can get away with the situation where you can have 100 million tons of food grains and you can have people dying of hunger. And from this itself, I think, comes out the second reason, which is the complete mismanagement of public policy. And that's what I want to get into the details of. So I would like to go a little bit into the details of PDS and how it functions and what the issues are. So currently, under the National Food Security Act, we have something called priority ration cards. And the Act specifies what percentage in each state in rural and urban areas will be seen to be part of this priority quota. And we find it's according to that 80 crore people have ration cards, and each state will have different criteria. For example, in Delhi, if you live in a Pakka house, if you live in a non-slum area, if you have an electricity bill above a certain amount, then you will not get a ration card. So the first kind of exclusions that we see happen is people who do not meet these criteria. But often what happens is it's not people who do not meet these criteria, but it is people who are not able to prove that they meet these criteria. So if you have to show that you are a resident of Delhi, then you need like a rental agreement, or you need an Aadhaar card which was made in Delhi at least 5 years back. Again, a lot of these workers are not able to do it. You have to show in a rural area that you're a hungry person, then you have to prove to the local sarpanch or whoever is in charge of doing this that you're poor, and they have their own vested interest in the system where they want to give the cards to somebody else and not those who are poor. As a result, what we have is a lot of many people who are actually the deserving poor who are left out of the system. This has reduced post the National Food Security Act simply because the coverage has increased. If 2/3 of the population is included in the ration system, obviously the number excluded goes down accordingly. But what we are seeing during this time of the lockdown is an issue where a lot of people who were excluded are now desperate to be included, which includes the the migrant workers. For example, migrant workers, say a UP worker in Delhi might have a ration card in his village in UP, but he cannot get ration on it when he shows that card in a shop in Delhi. So that is one of the problems. So what would the solution be? It's because of these issues that for a long time we have been demanding, and many economists also have been writing, and even people like Arvind Subramaniam, Amartya Sen, Raghuram Rajan, post the lockdown, have been talking about having a simple, universal public distribution system, at least till we wait through this crisis. How is universal different? It is different because you don't get into, and this might seem like a very small issue, but actually anybody who's ever dealt with government systems know that how we can get just stuck in this paperwork for anything. So when you immediately need food, if there was a system where we said that anybody who wants food can go to any ration shop that is close by to them, show an identity card, show your Aadhaar card, and say you need food and we'll give you food. That would have been a system which could have covered everybody who is in need. And why was that system warranted in the current times? One, because of the need, and two, also because we are sitting on these 100 million tons, which is really criminal, where we are also paying for the storage and we are paying for the wastage of these grains because they're not getting used. If it is so simple, if it's as simple as I'm saying it, that you have the grain, you distribute it, why is it that governments don't do? One, of course, that they don't care. The second reason that they don't do it is also because once you distribute the grain, then it gets counted as subsidy. So, for example, when the Food Corporation of India buys the grain from the farmer, then that is not subsidy because they're buying grain in return for the money that they are paying. But once they sell that grain at a lower price, then the difference in the price is what becomes subsidy, and it reflects in the government budget books. And that is something that they want to avoid. This is something that they've been wanting to avoid not just now, but for the last few years. So what we see is that in the last 3-4 years, the PDS is running, people are getting grains, but the government is not paying the FCI for the grains that the FCI is giving. As a result of which the FCI has taken loans from the National Small Saving Funds, which is again, it's our money, it's public money, on which it is paying interest. And currently the FCI has a debt of over 2.5 lakh crores to the National Small Saving Fund because it is because the government has not paid it for these programs that is there. So on the one hand, there is this whole issue of the subsidy increasing, but on the other hand, we are actually, paying interest on the money and wasting our drains just to do this accounting magic of it not being shown in the fiscal deficit. So I would in fact like to argue that this whole subsidy issue is completely misrepresented, and it is something that immediately gains public support because it makes obvious sense that if you don't have the money, then how can you spend it? But that's not how the macroeconomy works. At a time when there is a demand gap, which is what we have currently, what is in fact required is for the state to pay more. And one of the ways in which it can spend more is to do PDS, which is a form of income support to people. So one big part of this is this whole mismanagement of procuring food but not distributing it, not because we don't have a mechanism for distribution, but because we do not want this distribution to be reflected in our budget books as a subsidy. And this is something we really need to think about. This goes back to the the inequality that we have in our economy. The fiscal deficit, the concerns of fiscal deficit is highest amongst people who have savings, who are able to invest in the market. We are the ones who are concerned about the fiscal deficit because we think it will cause inflation and we think that it will reduce the value of our investments. But let's remember, firstly, that is not necessarily true, because when there is a demand gap, it's not necessary that the fiscal deficit will cause an inflation. Secondly, that there are hungry people. I think there is the root of this is basic constitutional values, where we have said in our preamble, we have talked about equality in our preamble, and you cannot have a situation where there are so many millions of tons of food grain lying in our godown, some of them being eaten by rats, some of them getting rotten now in the rain. And on the other hand, we have hungry people and we are not distributing, just cannot be acceptable. So that is where I would go back to the re-emphasize the positive part, that we have a system and that system functions, albeit at some level of lower level of equilibrium than it should be. But that is a system that needs to be strengthened and used much more. And let's remember that if we did not have that system, then probably the current crisis would have been much, much worse. Maybe we would have been seeing situations like the famines of the pre-independence era if we did not have that social security system that we had. But moving ahead a little bit on this whole issue of hunger and malnutrition, hunger is not only about filling your stomach with whatever is available. Right now, the PDS, even if it works and even if it's universal and reaches everybody, is giving only the rice and wheat. Whereas if we think of malnutrition and our malnutrition outcomes, for example, more than 50% of women in this country are anemic. So obviously there's something wrong with the diets of people as well. So if we look at the data of what is it that people in our country eat, if you've been seeing some of the rural reporting over the last 1 year, for example, Sayantan Bera in the Mint has been doing a number of studies. He's been doing these repeated stories of how when there are these food crises or when there is an income crisis, people keep reducing the quality of their diets. They come down to a roti and namak or roti and mirchi, plain rice with hardly any dal. Even if you see in Telangana, often the diets is rice and a chutney, some kind of a watery pulusu, which obviously nutritionally is very, very poor. And for this is also something that requires a system, and we don't have that system. So, for example, again, the National Family Health Survey looks at children in the age group of 6 to 23 months. That is, children who have just started complementary feeding, their breastfeeding is done until they're 2 years. And this age group, because this is supposed to be the age in which malnutrition sets in, this is the age in which you can reverse malnutrition. There are many studies which argue that you cannot reverse stunting very much after the age of 2 years. In this age group, the data shows, this is again official nationally representative data, it shows that only 22% of all children in our country get the minimum dietary diversity that is recommended by the WHO for children. Only 36% of the children get minimum meal frequency. Like those of us who've had young children or there are young children in the house, we know that children have tiny stomachs and they need to eat frequently and they need to eat calorie dense food. And both of these is completely lacking, where only 1/3 of the children eat the number of times that they should be eating, and only 22% of the children get the kind of dietary diversity that they should be getting. Even if we look at the adult data, just to reel off some other figures on, to you, just to understand the inequality and the kind of situation some people, most people in fact live in, more than half the women, adult women, this is 54% of the women said that they consume fruits occasionally or never. 60% of the women said that they consume eggs occasionally or never, over 70%. And this is not because they're vegetarian, this is because they cannot afford eggs and non-vegetarian food. There's data on that as well. 1/3 of the women said that they consume any milk products very occasionally or never. The other categories in this question was once in a week, every day, or once a month. So the numbers I've given you is over 50% of people consume what is called these higher quality foods nutritionally. Fruits, eggs, milk products rarely occur in the diets of the poor. And this again is because of issues of access, of issue of prices. And these are things for which we do not currently have any public programs in our imagination. We do have some programs for younger children through the ICDS, through the school midday meals. But overall, diets is a huge issue in our country. And so far, what I've been talking about and making a case is only to say at least the food grains. Let us at least ensure that people are not hungry. But that is really the basic minimal. What we really need to be thinking about is the kind of agriculture system we have, the kind of food system we have, where people get at least the basic protein, carbohydrate, fats, and micronutrients through their diets, which is the most healthy way in which you can get all of these. So this is the context of hunger and starvation in our country. And therefore, if we want to talk about addressing malnutrition, then it needs much, much more. It is not just the PDS, it's many, many more things. These are the things that I work on much more, in fact. So I just want to mention them quickly in 5 minutes before I end. What are these much, much more that I'm talking about? One would be the agriculture policy. And this is linked again. And all of this says about the short-sightedness in our public policy. For example, while it's good that we have the PDS, it's good that there's a minimum support price that is supporting the farmers. On the other hand, given the fact that the PDS is so obsessed with rice and wheat, the cropping patterns in the country have changed, where these are the only crops that are produced, where the returns to millets, the return to dals and so on are so weak that these are not remunerative crops for farmers. Whereas if we see both from the point of nutrition as well as from the point of climate crisis, millets and pulses, for example, are great because they consume very little water. They're usually produced by small farmers and they are good for nutrition. But we have arrived at a situation which is slightly improving in the last 3-4 years, where in fact we used to be pulse sufficient at one time, but now we depend on imported pulses and imported oil. Similarly, when we talk about malnutrition, while I've been focusing so much on food, we do know that malnutrition is multidimensional. It is not a problem only because of the shortage of food, whereas although in our country food continues to play a very big role, but along with food, healthcare, hygiene, sanitation, and even feeding practices for very young children are important components that contribute to malnutrition. And because it sets in at the age of early childhood, child care also is a very important component. And therefore you have to imagine things which in normal immediate common sense we might not think as being related to malnutrition. For example, if most women in our country are working, which they are in rural areas, whether they're counted as workers or not, who is taking care of that under 2 child? Who is feeding that child 5 times a day? Who's cooking so many times for that child to be able to eat so many times a day in a context where there are no refrigerators and there is no those kind of systems where you can store food? And local foods are important because they help the local economy as well and they are healthier. So then maternity entitlements, childcare centers, creches, all of this begins to be seen as part of our response to malnutrition. And that is where we have been lacking despite the last 10-15 years acknowledging that malnutrition is a problem. When I started working on malnutrition in Rangareddy district in 2000, it was in the early 2000s, about 2003-04, a big struggle for us to even prove that there is malnutrition. We used to be going around with these weighing machines and growth charts and showing that X number of children are severely undernourished, and the government officials would always counter us saying you're lying and this is not true, our data doesn't show it. So there is a shift in that to a large extent, that now we have nationally representative data. Policymakers recognize that there is malnutrition. There are these global indices which show that India is not doing well, but there is still no recognition that to address this malnutrition, you need to make food available and you need to take care of all these aspects of childcare, of women's education, and so on, so that, rather than focusing just on feeding practices, which is what the current policy is. So although we have a recognition of malnutrition, and this once again for me reflects how we disrespect the poor and do not understand the context in which they live, because in the context of malnutrition, again, often the government, both the previous and the current government, argues that this is because the diet diversity data that I shared with you, that we are in that situation not because people don't have food, but because people don't know how to eat and what to eat. And having worked now for years across the country, that's a really unfair way of looking at things. Yes, there are issues with feeding practices. Even educated middle class families need counseling to be able to do exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, need counseling to know. I mean, our grandmothers tell us, somebody has to tell us that you have to do that khichdi with the ghee for a young child. Yes, that is an issue, but that really is not the main issue. A household which does not have a variety of food, a household which has only cereals, which is depending on the PDS for even those cereals, cannot afford to feed their children this variety of food that we expect them to feed by just telling them that they should feed that. I want to give one anecdote on this, what happens when these counseling takes place, when we are all the time telling people what they should eat. Again, going back to Rangareddy district, when we were working there, the Anganwadi program used to have these beautiful posters. There would be this woman in the center and there would be all kinds of foods around her. So there was fish, there was eggs, there was green leafy vegetables, there was this thali with rice and dal, and there was milk, and there was curds, and so on. And the woman is sitting there. And these posters were all over the place, and they would all the time keep telling people, for those of you who are familiar with Telugu, Akural Tinali, that you have to eat green leafy vegetables, is what the Anganwadi worker, the ANM, everyone from the government would be telling them. Then we went to do a survey to find out what is going on, what do people eat. And we went to pregnant women and we would ask them, what do you eat when you're pregnant? Like, what extra do you eat? And back the answer would come, Akural Tintam. And we knew there were no Akuralu happening anywhere around there. But it was they knew that that was the right answer and that is what they have to give. But the supply wasn't there. They couldn't afford it. The rest of the family didn't think the woman needed any extra food. So there is a lot of course, problems within the society. But it all comes down to also that it needs support. It's not a behavioral issue. That is what I'm trying to basically say, that it is not a problem of behavior, which is what malnutrition is often made out to be. So I just want to conclude by saying 2 or 3 things. One, the lesson for me from this whole COVID experience, the takeaway, the hopeful, optimistic takeaway is that this COVID experience has highlighted the inequality in this country to many of us who were not aware that this is what is going on. And also it has highlighted the importance of having public systems of social support for the basic entitlements that people have. That universal public services for food, nutrition, health, social security are absolutely important, and we cannot do away with them completely, is something I think that this whole pandemic and lockdown has highlighted, be it in the case of food through the PDS, be it even in the case of responding to COVID itself. It is the public hospitals who first responded to the crisis, and even now the government is struggling to get private hospitals into this whole. Of course, there are private hospitals are also heterogeneous, and there's some doing, some not doing. But where are the most of the beds for COVID? Where is it that the treatment is happening? It is in the government hospitals. So the first, and I'm hoping therefore that through this, we will be able to see as a society that this whole argument that the public sector is useless, that these government services are useless, and therefore we have to move towards cash transfers would be kind of have less support, and that people will actually come to see the importance of having strengthened, effective public systems which are able to respond even better next time whenever there is a crisis. And there will be crises always come. Second, that the crisis currently is a crisis because it is for all of us, but we have been in a hunger crisis even before lockdown, even before COVID, and that crisis to some extent was being mitigated by these public systems, but it was continuing because of the level of apathy and the resistance to improve these systems. So the government is constantly facing this resistance to expanding their programs. One of my bosses in the Supreme Court Commissioner's office, Dr. N.C. Saxena, always used to say, Sarkar ek haath se deti hai aur 10 haath se leti hai. So they will do land acquisition without compensation. They will do all kinds of things. There won't be employment. On the other hand, you give a PDS, you give an Anganwadi. That's one way of looking at it. But even just giving it to that attitude also, it is a lifeline to the poor. And how do we strengthen them? And finally, the other thing that gives me hope is that these issues are now being reported much more. More and more people are taking interest in them because it's there in the front pages of our newspaper every day. And it is only through public action and public pressure that these issues come on the agenda of political parties. And therefore, I would like to end, despite all the gaps, on this more positive note, that this crisis, in fact, can be seen as an opportunity to strengthen our public systems, because I hope that after this crisis, there is a greater support for public systems in this country. I'd like to end there, and thank you, Ajay and Vikram, once again. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Deepa, for speaking to us. You have given us both data and analysis, which is very rare, what we get now. And we thank you immensely for that. I can see a stream of questions here, and we will go through those questions. But your insights have been very good. And there is one thing which this is also coming from another conversation we were having in another group, that you can't expect public systems to work at perfect systems when you don't take care of them in non-crisis times. I mean, I think that's a deep insight there. So we'll go through the questions, and there are quite a few. And the first one is, Is it a good option to decentralize the PDS to a panchayat level for the system to be more sensitive?
Absolutely, I think so. The more decentralized it is better, and that is the reason why, say, in a state like Kerala, it works better. If it is locally, then because it is at the panchayat level that people finally know who is poor, who is not, who needs it, and who doesn't. And that is where also people approach for accountability. So if the PDS is not working, they can go to the Sarpanch. They can't go to the MLA or the MP immediately. So it definitely, the more decentralized it is, both for accountability and implementation, the more effective it is. But it's not enough to say panchayat has to do it, but panchayat has no powers. I mean, we have to then hand it over to them completely and allow them to do it.
So what does it mean by handing it over to the panchayat? That they will do the procurement also?
Procurement is an exercise that cannot be so decentralized also, because one of the objectives of procurement is also to shift grain to areas where there is a shortage. Like say the Northeast, hilly states, they don't produce enough. So we do need a centralized agency to coordinate procurement. But what panchayats can do is to decide what is given, for instance. So say in a village in Karnataka, ragi is one of the main grain cereals they eat, then why should we force wheat onto them? The panchayat can say that we want ragi. Somewhere else they might say we want jawar. Somewhere else they might say they want kodu, kutki. And these are also nutritionally better. So there's certain things within broad guidelines. In the midday meal, for instance, what will be given is something the panchayat can decide. We don't have a need to have a centralized menu that on Monday, every school will give rice and sambar. That's not necessary. That's something the panchayat can decide. Tell them you have 4 rupees. You have to include cereal, protein, and vegetables. You decide how you do it. And so there is a sharing of tasks that can be done. Currently, it's all very centralized. Everything gets decided at the center or state level, and panchayat is just told to implement.
Deepa, there are 2 questions which I thought I could pass them on to you. One is, from a policy perspective, how influential is the PDS in its ability to change dietary preferences of people in our country? And the second one is, there is obviously, it appears, a gender aspect to the food crisis. How do you think that can be approached?
Okay. The first question on dietary preferences, I think the PDS can be very influential in changing dietary preferences, but it doesn't happen overnight. In fact, the PDS in our country has already changed dietary preferences once. It is post the PDS that this level of only rice and wheat has happened, and that has been through the PDS, because that is what was procured and distributed. And that's what was also seen as something aspirational, that if you become richer, then you move from coarse grains to this. It changed cropping patterns, it's changed dietary preferences. So now if we start giving millets, which under the Food Security Act you can do at 1 rupee a kilo, then people will start buying millets, and tastes take time to change. So over time, I think it would, it does have an influence, and our experience show that over the last 40 years, it did change in this country. So we can make the reverse change as well. Gender aspect, yes, it's actually a whole another talk, so I don't want to go into it very much. I would just for here say that recognizing that there is a gender aspect itself is the first step, right from within the household to the society level. Just one point I want to say, that although a lot of the gender aspect around nutrition works within the household, it's not as if there is no role for public policy in it. So again, just one example I want to give, what is coming to my mind immediately on gender, going back to Mominpet in Rangareddy. There was this program to reduce child marriages by the government. And one of the activities they did was to bring together all these young girls, and they had to take this pledge that they will not get married when they are before 18. So that's, from a gender lens, a horrible thing to do. Something you're doing for girl children, but who is asking that girl child if she wants to get married at 13? If I designed the program, I would have had only men in that program. I would have got young men to take the pledge. I would have got parents to take the pledge, but not the girl. So that is public policy with gender over decisions that happening within the household, and that is missing.
In a talk by Guvant Patelji, there was a case he made for no government role and free market for the agricultural sector for a more profitable and equitable society. So Mansi asks you, what are your views on this?
So there is a lot of farmers groups also demand for more pro market because they feel that it is the restrictions in the government that don't allow them to get right prices. But actually, if you look at it, that is not the case. Although we have an APMC Act, farmers are selling everywhere, and if there is agriculture across the world, in fact, yeah, that's a better way to start. There is no country in this world which has an unregulated agricultural sector. There is no country in this world, US, UK, EU, in fact, that is the whole debate in the WTO, that they subsidize their farmers much more than we do. So farming in itself is it's a sector where it's very difficult to have profits. And in a country like ours, where almost 50% of our people are still in agriculture and there is so much inequality, most of our farmers are also net consumers of food. So they're growing food, but they're buying food. They're not even growing enough for themselves. So in that context, there is a need for a lot of regulation in agriculture. What is even more needed and missing is a need for public infrastructure in agriculture. You know, you can reduce the regulation a little bit if we had all that, if we had the irrigation, if you had the access to seeds, if you had the access to markets. When we don't have those things, then price support becomes very important. And that is again, long-term investment in agriculture, which has not happened since the 90s.
There are a few questions which are asking about the connection of Aadhaar and PDS and the benefits under public schemes. What are your views on that?
Each of these questions are like, okay, again, I'll try and give a short answer. So I'm not getting into all the issues of privacy and surveillance and Aadhaar, just looking at technology and this kind of a digital solution to the problems in public programs. Kind of somewhere somebody have said that Aadhaar can be used for identification. So the first thing I want to say, so Aadhaar in PDS is supposed to do two things. It's supposed to do something called deduplication, which is that say Ajay Gandhi is holding 3 ration cards, one in the name of Ajay Gandhi, one in the name of Vikram, and one in the name of Deepa. Once your fingerprint is linked to these 3 cards, then they figure out that there are all these 3 are Ajay Gandhi, so we'll remove Vikram and Deepa. For that, Aadhaar is useful. But all surveys, government's own surveys, this is what they call ghost cards, have found that ghost cards is the least of the problems in PDS. And this is what they call identification. But the identification problem in PDS is not to say whether Ajay Gandhi is Ajay Gandhi or Ajay Gandhi is Vikram. The identification question in PDS is Ajay Gandhi poor or not? That Aadhaar doesn't tell you. Your fingerprint or your iris doesn't tell you whether you're poor and therefore you should have a card or you should not have a card. That has to be done by human beings. That is finally done by criteria that you decide on the basis of whatever studies that you do. And that is where there is discretion and that is where leakages happen. And therefore, Aadhaar could be a useful tool. This kind of technology can be useful in reducing leakages, but we must understand that technology is as powerful as the hands of the people who are using the technology is. So what we see now is that if the fair price dealer is still the dada of the village, which they are in a lot of Telangana villages also, then even when there is Aadhaar, he will swipe your card, he will take your fingerprint, and he'll give you 3 kgs in place of 5 kgs. There's nothing Aadhaar can do about it. So I'm not anti-technology, but technology has to come along with empowering people. Otherwise, it doesn't help.
Ajay Srivastava, my good friend, he asked a question. How about setting up parallel private distribution systems run by NGOs and international charity organizations? They could have their own system of identification and they can be used for high nutrition items.
Again, short answer to the question, we are 1.34 billion people in this country. There is no NGO, no parallel system that can do things in the scale in which the government can do here. Even in the lockdown, I've been associated with feeding programs and collecting funds. They play a very important role. But for long-term structural, putting structures in place, the role of NGOs can only be to show what works, to do demonstration through models. But if it's to be universal for everywhere across the country, there is no way a private system can do it by the sheer scale of it. There are, of course, other issues of accountability, rights, and so on, which has to be guaranteed through the state. If it's a private NGO, it's charity. I can't demand it. If it's the state, it's my right. But even without going into it, I think just logistically, given the size of our country, it's just not possible for any private system to do what the government can do.
You're muted, Ajay.
Another question that is asked is, will social audits and participation of SHGs, cooperatives and NGOs in ensuring the transparency of PDS system at ground level help corruption and feudal behavior of the Russian shop owners?
Absolutely, and there are many examples of this across the country. Social audits, transparency helps. Ultimately, collective action by local people who are the beneficiaries of these schemes is the most effective way in which we can make it functional. Even in the feudal systems, if it is an individual, it's more easier to exploit. When it is a collective out there in the public, even for the dominant people, it is more difficult to exploit. And so if we support these kind of mechanisms, and this has been shown in many parts of the country, it works.
Suhim asks you a question. I mean, actually, you will answer first before you get the question. The answer is 0, but the question is this. If you had 100 suggestions for public policy and its implementation efficiency, how many do you think the government, Indian government, is likely to implement?
I don't want to say 0. I want to twist the question a little bit. Yeah. If we don't see, the government is also a big monster. There is no one government, and we often find that you can bring in many small changes at the state level, at the district level, and these are also very important. And especially reforms to do with implementation happens at those levels. And as a campaign also, we have been often very successful at the state or the district level. Sometimes at the national level, that takes more work. But saying 0 would be giving up on democracy. Still don't want to do it.
Okay. Attached to this question is then the division of powers between the center and the state on food. Can you comment on it? Should it be an exclusive central subject? Should it be a state subject? Should it be a concurrent subject? What do you think in your experience?
Currently, if we talk about the PDS, agriculture is a state subject. If we talk about the PDS, currently it's central. And states are in charge of implementation, which is why if you've been following the news, now when they're saying so many people have not got grains, the government of India quite easily says that we have given the grain, the state has not reached it to people. But when it is like this, what happens is there is no flexibility also. So to give an example, the government had made an announcement in May that 8 crore migrant workers will be given food grains. And that the states have not given because they gave states the grains, but they didn't tell them how to identify these migrant workers. And I was just yesterday talking to a senior bureaucrat, a retired bureaucrat in the food ministry, trying to understand what's happening. This is what he also said. He said, now suddenly we have to distribute grain to new people and you've not laid out a mechanism for us. Tomorrow there will be some vigilance committee, something investigation on me. So nobody will do it till there is a guideline. You've not said we can make the guideline. You have not given the guideline, so it won't happen. So there needs to be greater decentralization, greater flexibility, and something really missing in our entire public program is the whole trust, the trust deficit, that we are always suspicious of the people that we are giving benefits to. And therefore, so many things that people have to keep repeatedly, again and again, keep proving that they're poor. You know, and the officer keeps having to make them prove that they're poor because otherwise the officer feels that he will be charged of corruption. So it's all this paperwork and all that, which if it's more decentralized, I feel can be better taken care of. But even in terms of procurement, I feel it needs to be decentralized. The role of FCI needs to become more of a coordinating agency than something that keeps doing everything. So there are, there's no time to go into details, but there are many things which can be decentralized that will allow for a variety of food items to be procured. And states can first keep what they need and then give the excess into a central pool which goes to all this can easily be done in this era of computerization and so
on. As you said in your talk, there are two ways in which a state can do welfare to the people. One is through providing food and other welfare benefits as it's doing today, and the other was cash direct transfer. Both from a theoretical and practical point of view, why is one preferred over the other?
So if I can nuance the question a little bit, So the problem is that we are looking at it one over the other. But if we look at the examples of countries where now universal basic income is beginning, or even countries like say Brazil, which before this Bolsonaro time was really doing very, very well on welfare, it's always been a combination of these two. There are certain things which cash does not make up for. What we study as market failures in economics. So education, health, these are not like soap or toothpaste, that the market doesn't work in the same way. These are merit goods, they have externality, so the market doesn't set a efficient price for these goods, and therefore the state is always needed for these. There are other things that cash can help, which can be that it is a substitute additional income. The problem in India is that it's always been seen as an either or. So there are certain things for which cash is very useful, like old age pensions. Poor people working in the informal sector, after they stop working, cash in the form of pensions is very useful. We do have those schemes as well. But cash in the place of food is not as useful, because that cash doesn't play the same role that the food can play. The food is bringing you the grain into the village. It is something that you spend, ensuring that you have that grain in the household. It is at one level, you're also ensuring that people are eating at least the basic minimum, because there's so many pressures. There was a pilot study in Delhi many years back where, for instance, it was found that when they gave cash, one of the first things people did was to pay off their old debt, because there's so much in debt on informal credit. They paid off the debt, they used it on health expenditure and so on, and they still remained hungry. So it has to be a combination of all this. It cannot be, cash cannot play the role of a school, of a health center, of a ration shop. We need all those structures, plus we might need cash for certain things.
Very interesting answer. One more question from Sriram. Right now, today, as you see, which are the areas in the country which you see more prone to famine, especially now with the movement of the migrant workers, and maybe you won't have enough people to work on the farms, and does this movement, exacerbate the problem of famine in the next year or two?
This movement will exacerbate certain problems, not of famine in the sense of food shortages. I don't think that is something that is going to happen. In fact, there are already reports from Bihar, for instance, that Punjab farmers are sending trucks to get people back to work. So I don't feel, we don't know, we'll have to see how the sowing happens to the next crop, but we have enough stock. So I don't think there will be a huge problem as far as food production goes. But on the other hand, there is definitely, and that also reports are coming, there will be a huge problem of livelihood and people having money, not having money, and therefore not being able to buy food. Like Bihar has had some 40 or 50 lakh people who have come back by the official numbers, probably even more. And we must remember, all these people went out because they had nothing to do in those states in the first place. So now when they come back, you have double the number of people. With the economy being in a slump, and therefore if NREJ doesn't pick up, if they don't quickly give ration cards to these returnee migrants, then we can see a huge crisis in states like UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, parts of Odisha, but Odisha state government has been doing a lot of things already, which are the states from which migrants go out and where they have come back, which are also the hunger pockets of the country, even in normal times.
One of your fans, I won't identify him, he's asking a question. What are the prospects of a policy change in the PDS which impact the farming patterns as of today? He also asked a question on monoculture. He's saying that it's one of the largest perils of agriculture.
Agreed. Prospects, again, there is a vision of an alternative kind of PDS, which is not being bought other than in very small scale experiments kind of thing. And this vision for an alternative PDS, which I was kind of briefly mentioning earlier also, is one where it is much more decentralized, where the procurement is not just of rice and wheat, but in fact, like you have district health planning, you have district education planning, you have a district food planning. You look at everything that's grown, everything that is eaten, you procure accordingly, you have small storage units at the district level, like and change even say the midday meal. For instance, in the midday meal, you don't have to give rice every day. You can give all kinds of cereals, you include other crops. So there is a big possibility. Again, to give an example, Brazil, the school midday meal program, they linked it with their agriculture procurement program. So they said that 30% of whatever food goes into the school midday meal has to be procured from the local area through the small farmer procurement program. And therefore you saw that in some region of Brazil in season, they were giving strawberry juice as part of the midday meal. Somewhere else it was a steak and some salad. Different regions had different foods, but this thing of looking at the food system, which is what it's called, together, there are huge prospects, and now the UN, the FAO have models, they're talking about this. But currently that kind of thinking is not happening at the government in India.
Another question here is that why isn't the corporate social responsibility agenda? It doesn't include any items on food. It includes on education. It includes maybe some on health. But
it has nutrition maybe. So there is a lot of CSR that happens around food though, like say Akshay Patra, providing food in schools can be seen as something that's part of that agenda. I don't know how that list was made, and there's a lot of critique of that list of corporate social responsibility also. I also at one level believe that that 2% of profit that they are giving, if they gave it as tax which went into a social welfare fund of the government and was used for these programs, it would probably be much more useful than each corporate trying to think of its own way of using this fund and doing various things.
Yeah.
And you have said in the early part of your talk that all these schemes had to be implemented only after citizen struggles in many ways. Why is it that the poor still have not revolted against the government, against the state, whichever government it is, it doesn't matter? And why is it that that struggle continues to be done, but is this whole large volume of large number of poor people not a large enough vote bank for the government to actually work for them?
Again, I wish I had a straight answer to this question. I think that's what so many people in this country are trying to answer. So I'll try and give a short, simple answer. It's not a full answer. It is, of course, a puzzle at one level, that how is it that when there is so much hunger, why is it that these issues don't become mainstream political agenda? There's, of course, the one whole thing of the identity politics, be it based on caste or religion or so on, which seems to take over in electoral politics in India, given the kind of feudal society that we are. At the same time, I would also like to say that it's the poor resist in multiple ways, and we have to also, that is why I kept coming back to not to take away their agency from them, but if you look at the history in our own country, that only when the middle class also joins hands, that does it really become a mainstream agenda. And we must remember, often, like say something like the Right to Food campaign, we're often working with the poorest of the poor. So we do a dharna in Delhi. It's very difficult for us to bring 100,000 people here, not because we cannot mobilize 100,000 people or so many people are not with us, but they're not people who can leave their homes for 5 days, afford to take a train and come and sit here in Jantar Mantar and not get wages for so many days. So there are that kind of visible mass mobilization that happens is very difficult for the really poor to participate in as well, which is why despite all the inequality, we need to really know what our fellow citizens are like and do, solidarity is very important, I feel. And the way the economy is going, one doesn't know. I mean, if the situation becomes so desperate, there have been instances in Surat of food riots, for instance. We could see violent responses to this.
Can you tell us a little about the Right to Food movement that you have been part of?
So the
what do you aim to achieve? How do you aim to achieve that?
Well, it's a network of organizations, individuals, and other networks. And the idea of the network coming together was to put pressure on the government to play their constitutional role of ensuring that nobody sleeps hungry, if I want to put it in one line. So the campaign itself does not do any direct intervention in terms of feeding or running projects or anything. It's a completely unfunded network which runs on individual donations for activities that we do. But we've had, it's an influential network because it has a lot of people working on the ground across the country. Also a number of, you mentioned, John, there's earlier. He has been a long associate of the campaign. There are many other people who've been associated, who've been able to put together these ground experiences to what national policy should look like. So, but the aim entirely is to enable this process of putting pressure on the state to do what it should be doing, and not to actually do any, like directly provide any service.
Very, very interesting question here. Why does the government, how are Annapurna and Amma canteens working? Are they good things to do? And why does government get into value addition products in food?
Actually, these Amma canteens are great programs, if you look at it, in urban areas. Because, this whole, like the current migrant crisis, oftentimes migrants are single males or single people who don't have homes. So for them, cooked food is much better than giving food grains. And it is a lot of people eat out in our country, in the working class, and they eat very unhealthy. They eat deep fried food and so on. So these Amma canteens are a good way to provide an affordable meal to people. And this is also something that we learned from Brazil. Brazil is a hugely urbanized country, and part of their zero hunger program, one of their main interventions was, they called them, there was some Portuguese word for it. Basically, it was called something restaurant, public restaurant, which was like these Amma canteens, where you had these huge canteens where anybody can go and eat. It was cheap, good quality, nutritious food. And that is also a shortage in our country. The other benefit of Amma canteen is also the employment it generates. In Tamil Nadu, it's women's SHGs who are doing it, and at a minimum wage, which they would otherwise not get anywhere. So when I visited Amma canteen about 3 years back, they were giving 300 rupees a day for women who were working in those canteens, which was a very decent wage at that time as a alternative for what they were getting. So, and this links to the issue I couldn't talk about, which is India is also beginning to face a double burden in the sense of increasing obesity and the micronutrient malnutrition. The newer problems which we'll have to look at, moving away from processed, ultra processed, ready to eat foods to healthier, nutritious foods. And these canteens can really play a role in doing that.
One question asked is tradable food coupons likely to be solving a lot of problems of balancing food requirements between states? And also, why are dairy, meat and eggs not included in PDS?
I wish dairy, meat and eggs were included in PDS. That has been one of our demands also. Logistically also, dairy and meat especially difficult unless you have this decentralized vision of PDS. If it's centralized, imagine stocking so much milk and meat, it would be a disaster, but it should be done from a nutrition point of view. In terms of food coupons, I feel we are not yet there in terms of the system, in terms of availability. If the meaning of food coupons is like they have in America, where the poor get coupons and they can go to the supermarket and buy using them, we are a little away from that, because even the availability of things, market availability is very less. And although sometimes we have this vision of rural India having fruits and vegetables, everything freely available, that's really not true. Most villages don't have anything, and even only the bigger villages have a market once a week, a santa that happens in the market village. Otherwise, they buy all these kind of things only when they go to the block or the mandal for some other work, and that is difficult. So we do need the coupons. I don't think the system is still there for us.
Last one or two questions, Deepa. One question is, why PM Garib Kalyan Yojana, when the government could have increased funds under the Manrega to those 116 districts? And should government include districts from Chhattisgarh, AP and Telangana, which has a large number of migrants?
This is something I also didn't understand. When we have a Narega across the country, why they couldn't just say that we will not have the 100-day limit, but like they have for drought affected areas that you can extend it to 150 days. They could have just said that under Narega, now because there's a crisis, we will not put that 100-day limit and do it everywhere, and there is a system. So I have also not understood what the politics of this is, of again focusing on these districts. I think it should just be done through the Narega.